The champagne glass felt cold against my palm, condensation trickling down my fingers like the tears I refused to let fall. I had spent 3 hours getting ready for this party, 3 hours of carefully applying makeup to hide the dark circles under my eyes from countless sleepless nights. 3 hours of selecting the emerald dress Graham had bought me for our 20th anniversary, the one that still hung in my closet with the tags on because he had criticized my appearance every time I considered wearing it. 3 hours of styling my hair the way he liked it, soft waves that framed my face and made me look younger than my 52 years, though he would never admit to noticing. I had done everything right, or so I thought. The Hartwell Financial Group's annual gala was in full swing around us, the ballroom of the Grandview Hotel glittering with crystal chandeliers and the sparkle of expensive jewelry adorning the necks and wrists of women who had never had to question their worth. 200 of Graham's colleagues mingled beneath those lights, their laughter echoing off the marble floors, their conversations weaving together into a symphony of corporate ambition and carefully curated small talk that made my head spin with its superficiality. I watched my husband work the room, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled with the expensive pomade he ordered from France, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection by a clothier who had been dressing executives for 40 years. At 54, Graham Mitchell still carried himself like the successful man he had always wanted to be. Regional Vice President of Investment Strategies. The title rolled off his tongue like honey whenever he introduced himself, and I had watched him do it 17 times in the past hour alone, each repetition accompanied by that practiced humble smile that made people believe he was somehow surprised by his own importance. When he finally made his way back to my side, I felt that familiar flutter of hope in my chest. The same hope that had kept me in this marriage for 23 years. The same hope that had survived countless cutting remarks, endless criticism, and the slow erosion of everything I once believed about myself. Hope is a strange thing. It can keep you alive when everything else has failed, but it can also keep you trapped in situations you should have escaped long ago. I leaned in to kiss him. A simple gesture, the kind of thing wives did at parties, a small show of affection, a moment of connection in a sea of strangers. I wanted, just for a second, to feel like we were partners instead of adversaries, like the early days of our marriage before everything went wrong. Graham pulled back like I had tried to burn him with acid. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that I stumbled slightly in my heels. My champagne sloshed in its glass, a few drops splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth beside us, staining the fabric with spreading circles of pale gold. And then he said the words that would change everything. "You're uglier than a barn cow." His voice was loud, deliberately loud, loud enough that the conversations around us stuttered and stopped like a record scratching, loud enough that heads turned in our direction with expressions of shock and fascination, loud enough that the entire corner of the ballroom fell silent to witness my humiliation in high definition. "Why would I kiss you?" Graham continued, his lips curling into a smile I had never seen before. Cold, cruel, satisfied, like a cat that had finally caught the mouse it had been toying with for years. "I'd rather kiss the cow." The laughter started somewhere to my right, a snicker that grew into a chuckle, then spread like wildfire through the crowd. Within seconds, the people around us were doubled over, wiping tears from their eyes, clutching their stomachs as if my husband had just delivered the punchline of the century, their faces blurred together in my vision, a kaleidoscope of open mouths and shaking shoulders, of people who saw my pain as entertainment. I stood frozen. The champagne glass trembled in my hand, the liquid inside creating tiny waves that matched the tremors running through my body. The emerald dress that had made me feel beautiful just hours ago now felt like a costume, a pathetic attempt at disguise that everyone could see through. I was suddenly aware of every flaw Graham had ever pointed out, every pound I had gained, every wrinkle that had appeared, every gray hair I had missed when touching up my roots. 23 years. 23 years of marriage, of building a life together, of raising 2 children who had fled across the country the moment they could. 23 years of supporting his career while sacrificing my own, of attending countless parties just like this one, of smiling and nodding and pretending everything was fine while something inside me slowly died. 23 years reduced to a punchline at a company party. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes you find something there that you never expected. Sometimes, in the darkness at the bottom of the pit, someone else has dug for you. You find the version of yourself you buried so long ago, you forgot she existed. Sometimes the cruelest blow becomes the wake-up call you needed all along. I smiled, not a forced smile, not a polite smile, not the smile I had perfected over 2 decades of pretending everything was fine while my soul slowly suffocated. This was something different, something real, something that came from a place I had forgotten existed. A reservoir of strength that had been waiting patiently for me to remember it was there. The smile made the laughter around me falter just slightly, just enough for me to see the first flicker of uncertainty cross Graham's face. He had expected tears. He had expected me to run away in shame. He had expected me to crumble the way I had always crumbled when he criticized me in private. But this wasn't private, and something about the public nature of his cruelty had finally snapped the chains I had been wearing for so long. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table with careful precision, the crystal making a soft clink against the polished surface. Then I smoothed the front of my emerald dress, lifted my chin to a height I hadn't achieved in years, and walked directly toward the DJ station at the far end of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, their laughter dying in their throats as they watched me approach the small platform where a young man in a black shirt was queuing up the next song. He looked up as I climbed the 2 steps to join him, confusion evident in his young eyes. "I need the microphone," I said. My voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman who had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. He handed it to me without question, perhaps too surprised to do anything else, perhaps recognizing in my expression that this was not a moment to argue. I turned to face the room. 200 faces stared back at me, some curious, some amused, some already pulling out their phones to capture whatever scene was about to unfold. Graham stood frozen near the appetizer table, his confident smile finally cracking around the edges as he realized his entertainment had gone off script. The silence was so complete I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass across the room. I raised the microphone to my lips, and I said 3 words that turned every laugh into dead silence. But before I tell you what those words were, you need to understand how I got here. You need to understand who I was before I became the woman standing on that stage, holding a microphone, about to destroy the man who had spent 23 years systematically destroying me from the inside out, because this story doesn't start at a party in a fancy hotel ballroom. It starts in a college library, 25 years ago, when a shy accounting major fell in love with a charming business student who promised her the world and delivered something else entirely. And it ends with 3 words that burned that world to the ground. I met Graham Mitchell in the fall of 1998 in the dusty stacks of Pemberton University's Henderson Library. I was 27 years old, working on my MBA while holding down a full-time job as a junior accountant at Morrison & Associates, a small but respected firm in downtown Ashford. Most nights, I didn't leave the library until they turned off the lights at midnight, my eyes burning from reading financial textbooks and my fingers stained with highlighter ink. He was 29, finishing his own business degree after a few years of finding himself traveling through Europe on his parents' money. Later, I would learn that those years of self-discovery had actually been years of failed ventures and burned bridges, of disappointed families and unpaid debts. But at the time, all I saw was a confident man with an easy smile and stories that made the world seem bigger than the small life I had imagined for myself. The first thing I noticed about him was his laugh. It filled the quiet library like music, earning sharp looks from the students trying to study and a reluctant smile from me as I peered around the bookshelf to see who was making such a commotion. He was standing near the circulation desk, charming the librarian into waiving his overdue fines with a combination of self-deprecating humor and what I would later recognize as weaponized charisma. He caught me looking, and instead of being embarrassed by the attention his noise had attracted, he walked right over and introduced himself. "Graham Mitchell," he said, extending his hand with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "And you are far too beautiful to be hiding in the finance section on a Friday night." I should have recognized the flattery for what it was. I should have seen the calculation behind those warm brown eyes, the practiced ease of his charm that spoke of years of perfecting this particular approach. But I was 27 years old and had spent most of my life being told I was plain, practical, and forgettable. My mother, rest her soul, had always said I had a face for radio and a personality for accounting, as if being good with numbers was a consolation prize for failing at everything else. My father had nodded along at the dinner table, adding that at least I was smart enough to make a good living, even if I would never turn heads walking down the street. So when Graham Mitchell looked at me like I was the most interesting person he had ever met, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that someone could see past the sensible shoes and the thick glasses and the perpetually ink-stained fingers to find something worth loving underneath. I was so hungry for that validation that I couldn't see the trap being set. Our courtship was a whirlwind of romantic gestures and passionate declarations. Graham was everything I wasn't. Bold where I was cautious, spontaneous where I was planned, confident where I was doubtful. He took me to restaurants I could barely afford and insisted on paying, waving away my protests with assurances that money was meant to be enjoyed. He showed up at my office with flowers just because, making my coworkers sigh with envy at my good fortune. He told me I was beautiful so often that I started to believe it might actually be true, though some quiet part of me always wondered why he had to say it so frequently if it was really obvious. We were married 8 months after we met, in a small ceremony at my parents' church in Millbrook. My mother cried throughout the service, though I was never entirely sure if it was from happiness or disbelief that her plain daughter had actually found someone willing to marry her. My father shook Graham's hand afterward and told him he was getting a good woman, the kind who would keep his house clean and his books balanced. Graham laughed and said he couldn't wait to have me keep everything in perfect order. I should have heard the warning in those words. I should have noticed how he said, "Keep me," rather than have me as a partner, as if I was a possession to be managed rather than a person to be loved. But I was too busy being grateful that anyone wanted me at all. I was too busy counting my blessings instead of counting the red flags. The first year of marriage was everything I had dreamed of, or at least everything I had been taught to dream of. We rented a small apartment in Ashford, close to both our jobs, with windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street and enough room for a small dining table where we ate together every evening. Graham had landed a position at Hartwell Financial Group as a junior analyst, and I continued climbing the ranks at Morrison & Associates, earning praise for my attention to detail and my ability to find discrepancies that others missed. We watched old movies on weekends, talked about the children we would have someday, and fell asleep in each other's arms like the world outside our little apartment couldn't touch us. Lauren came along 2 years later, a beautiful baby girl with her father's dark hair and my green eyes. I took 3 months of maternity leave and returned to work, feeling like I had it all: a loving husband, a healthy daughter, and a career that was finally starting to take off. Catherine Morrison herself had called me into her office before my leave ended to discuss my trajectory, hinting at a partnership track that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. That's when things began to change. It started small, so small that I barely noticed at first. Comments about dinner being late because I had gotten stuck at work, delivered with a sigh that suggested my career was an inconvenience rather than a contribution. Questions about why Lauren's diaper bag wasn't packed properly, as if I was the only one responsible for remembering every item. Suggestions that perhaps I should consider a less demanding position so I could focus on my real responsibilities. The word real landing with an emphasis that made everything else seem frivolous. "You're spreading yourself too thin, Meredith," Graham would say, using the full name he knew I hated because my mother had chosen it, and I had spent my childhood wishing I was a simple Jennifer or Sarah. Lauren needs her mother. I need my wife. This career obsession of yours is affecting our family. I should have pushed back. I should have reminded him that my career obsession was paying half our mortgage and funding his expensive taste in suits and imported wines. I should have pointed out that he never seemed to worry about his own work hours affecting our family, despite the evenings he spent networking and the weekends he devoted to cultivating relationships with senior partners. But I had spent my entire life being told I wasn't enough, and Graham's criticism felt like confirmation of everything I had always feared about myself. He was just being honest, I told myself. He was just looking out for our family. He was just trying to help me see what was truly important. So I made compromises. I turned down the promotion that would have required more travel, watching the opportunity go to a colleague with half my experience but none of my domestic obligations. I started working from home 2 days a week, squeezing my responsibilities into nap time and late nights. I rearranged my schedule around Lauren's daycare pickup and Graham's networking dinners and the endless demands of a household that somehow became entirely my responsibility, despite the fact that 2 adults lived there. By the time Brandon was born 3 years later, I had left Morrison and Associates entirely. Graham had been promoted twice by then, and he convinced me that we didn't need my salary anymore. We could afford for me to stay home, to focus on the children, to create the perfect family life that would support his continued rise through the corporate ranks. He made it sound like a gift, this opportunity to abandon everything I had worked for. He made it sound like freedom. I remember the day I cleaned out my desk at the firm. My nameplate, which had read Meredith Mitchell, senior accountant for 3 years, went into a cardboard box along with my framed diplomas and the small cactus I had kept on my windowsill. Catherine Morrison stood in my office doorway and watched me pack, her arms crossed and her expression troubled. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid someone might overhear her speaking such heresy. "I've seen this before, Meredith. Talented women walking away from their careers for men who don't deserve the sacrifice. You'll regret this." I smiled and told her she didn't understand. Graham loved me. He just wanted what was best for our family. She shook her head slowly, then walked to her own office and returned with a business card. "Keep this," she said, pressing it into my palm with an urgency that should have told me something. "When you're ready to come back, call me. Day or night, Meredith. I mean it." I tucked the card into my wallet and forgot about it for 15 years. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had called sooner. Sometimes I wonder who I might have become if I had listened to Catherine instead of Graham. But those are questions without answers, paths not taken that lead nowhere but regret. The transition from working professional to stay-at-home mother was harder than I expected, harder than any of the parenting books or magazine articles had prepared me for. I had spent my entire adult life finding my worth in my accomplishments, in the satisfaction of solving complex financial puzzles, in the recognition of colleagues who valued my expertise and sought my opinion. Now my days were measured in laundry loads and grocery lists, in playground visits and pediatrician appointments, in the endless repetition of tasks that no one ever thanked me for because they were simply expected. I remember standing at my kitchen sink one afternoon, hands submerged in soapy water, watching the other mothers in our neighborhood through the window as they gathered on the sidewalk to chat while their children played. They looked so comfortable in their roles, so at ease with the domestic sphere that felt like a cage to me. I wondered if there was something wrong with me, some fundamental flaw that made me incapable of finding fulfillment in what society told me should be enough. Graham's career continued to soar during those years. Junior analyst became senior analyst, became team leader, became department manager. Each promotion brought longer hours at the office, more business trips that took him away for days at a time, more networking events that I attended as the supportive spouse, smiling and nodding and pretending to be interested in conversations about market trends and investment strategies that I probably understood better than most of the men discussing them. I became invisible, not gradually, but suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch the moment I stopped producing work that could be measured and valued. At parties, people would ask what I did, and when I said I was a stay-at-home mother, their eyes would glaze over, and they would excuse themselves to find someone more interesting to talk to. My old friends from work stopped calling because I had nothing to contribute to conversations about office politics and client management. Even my own family began treating me like an afterthought, inviting Graham to important events and assuming I would just tag along like an accessory. But the worst part was watching how Graham changed. The man who had once told me I was beautiful started pointing out every flaw with the precision of a surgeon identifying sites for incision. The husband who had swept me off my feet with spontaneous gestures of affection became cold and distant, rationing out scraps of kindness like they were precious resources he couldn't afford to waste on someone who no longer contributed anything of value. "You should do something about your hair," he would say over breakfast, not looking up from his newspaper. "It's looking gray." "Are you trying to look like my mother?" "You should lose some weight," he would mention while I was getting dressed for one of his events, his eyes tracking my reflection in the mirror with barely concealed disgust. "That dress makes you look like a stuffed sausage. What will people think?" "You should try to be more interesting," he would sigh after parties where I had spent hours standing alone while he worked the room. "People must think I married you for your money." "Oh, wait, you don't have any of that either." Each comment was a tiny cut. Individually, they might have healed, might have been forgotten as momentary cruelty born of stress or fatigue. But together, delivered day after day, year after year, they carved away pieces of me until I barely recognized the woman staring back from the mirror. I became an expert at makeup, not to enhance my features, but to hide the evidence of late nights spent crying into my pillow. I learned to dress in ways that didn't draw attention, to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible, so as not to invite criticism. I stopped speaking up at family dinners because Graham would roll his eyes and change the subject. I stopped inviting friends over because he would make pointed comments about the state of the house or the quality of my cooking or the inadequacy of my conversation. The children noticed. Of course they noticed. Children always see more than we give them credit for, even when we think we're protecting them from the truth. Lauren, who had always been observant, started asking me why Daddy was so mean to me when we were alone. Her small face creased with confusion at the contradiction between the father who played with her and the husband who made her mother cry. Brandon, sweet, sensitive Brandon, would crawl into my lap after one of Graham's tirades and pat my cheek with his small hand, his eyes too knowing for a child of 6. "Don't be sad, Mommy," he would whisper. "I think you're pretty." I would hold him close and promise myself that tomorrow would be different, that Graham was just stressed from work, that things would get better once he got the next promotion, once we moved to a bigger house, once the children were older, and we had more time together. But tomorrow never came. The next promotion only made Graham more demanding, more critical, more convinced of his own superiority and my inferiority. The bigger house just gave him more things to criticize, more spaces that weren't clean enough, more rooms that weren't decorated properly, more evidence of my failure to create the perfect home he deserved. And as the children grew older, they didn't provide more time together. They provided more witnesses to a marriage that was slowly suffocating under the weight of one man's need to feel superior by making everyone around him feel small. The years blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. Lauren graduated high school with honors, then college with a degree in computer science, then moved across the country to Seattle for a job at a tech company that paid her more in her first year than I had ever earned in my brief career. Brandon followed 2 years later, accepting a position in Boston that put 3,000 miles between himself and his parents. I told myself they were pursuing opportunities, following their dreams, doing exactly what young people should do. I didn't admit, even to myself, that they were escaping, that they had learned, as children of difficult homes always learn, that distance is the only protection from people who hurt you while claiming to love you. And then it was just Graham and me, alone in a house that had never felt like home, circling each other like strangers who happened to share an address. The silence between us grew thicker with each passing day, filled with words unspoken and resentments unresolved. He worked longer hours than ever, came home later and later, barely acknowledged my existence except to criticize. I floated through days that felt identical, cleaning a house that was never clean enough, cooking meals that were never good enough, existing in a space between living and dying that had no name but felt like drowning. That's when I started finding things. It began with a receipt. Graham had always been meticulous about his finances, keeping his wallet organized with military precision and his credit card statements filed away in his home office in alphabetical order by month and year. I had long since stopped asking about money, since he had made it clear that household finances were his domain, and my interference was neither wanted nor welcome. The one time I had questioned a charge on our joint account, he had spent an hour lecturing me about trust and respect and the proper roles of husbands and wives. But one morning, about 18 months before the party, I was emptying his suit pockets before taking his clothes to the dry cleaner. It was a task I had performed thousands of times over our marriage, usually finding nothing more exciting than breath mints and business cards and the occasional forgotten shopping list. This time, I found a receipt from the Riverside Inn, a hotel I had never heard of, located about 45 minutes outside the city in a direction Graham had no reason to travel for work. The charge was for $387, including room service for 2 people and a bottle of champagne, and the date was the previous Tuesday, a night Graham had told me he was working late on a crucial presentation that couldn't possibly wait. I stood in our laundry room for a long time, holding that thin slip of paper, feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of everything I thought I knew. Not anger, not yet. Just a cold, calculating awareness that I had been looking at my marriage through a filter that didn't match reality, that the explanations I had accepted, the excuses I had believed, the lies I had swallowed whole might have been exactly that. Lies. I could have confronted him. That's what a normal wife would have done. storming into his office with evidence in hand, demanding explanations and apologies and promises that it would never happen again. But I had spent 23 years with Graham Mitchell. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He would deny everything, his voice dripping with wounded innocence. He would turn it around on me, accusing me of being paranoid and ungrateful and impossible to please. He would suggest that my suspicious nature was the real problem in our marriage, that a loving wife would trust her husband instead of snooping through his pockets like some kind of detective. And by the end, I would be apologizing to him for daring to question his integrity. I would be the one begging forgiveness. I would be the one feeling guilty for finding evidence of his betrayal instead of him feeling guilty for committing it. So instead of confronting him, I started paying attention. I began checking his pockets every time I did laundry, developing a systematic approach that left no seam unexplored. I noted the nights he came home late and the excuses he gave, keeping a small notebook hidden in my nightstand where I recorded times and explanations. I started logging into our bank account online, something he had told me not to worry about years ago, and discovered a pattern of withdrawals and charges that painted a very different picture than the one Graham presented to me and the world. The Riverside Inn appeared 3 more times over the next 2 months. Always on nights, he claimed to be working late or traveling for business. Always, for roughly the same amount. I researched the hotel and found it was known for its privacy and discretion, a favorite spot for affairs and secret rendezvous, with a staff trained not to ask questions and rooms available by the hour. But the hotel was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into our finances, applying the forensic accounting skills I hadn't used in 15 years but had never truly forgotten, I found other things that didn't add up. Large transfers to an account I didn't recognize, always in round numbers, always on the 15th of each month, like clockwork. Expenses for things that never appeared in our home, jewelry and clothing and electronics that I had never seen or worn or used. Credit card charges for restaurants on nights he said he was traveling, charges made in our own city at establishments I had never visited. I was an accountant by training, even if I hadn't practiced in a decade and a half. Numbers told stories if you knew how to read them, and the story our bank accounts were telling was one of systematic deception on a scale I hadn't imagined possible. Someone was spending our money on things that weren't meant for me. Someone was living a parallel life that I knew nothing about, and that someone was the man I had been married to for 23 years. The smart thing would have been to hire a lawyer and start planning my exit, pack a bag, find an apartment, serve papers before Graham knew what was happening. But I wasn't ready for that. Not because I loved Graham. That particular illusion had shattered somewhere between the 4th hotel receipt and the $3,000 charge for a weekend at a spa I had never visited. I wasn't ready because I still didn't know the full scope of what I was dealing with. And I needed to know. After 23 years of being kept in the dark, of having information withheld and explanations denied, I needed to see exactly what my husband had been hiding. I needed to understand the true shape of my prison before I could plan my escape, so I reached out to the one person I thought might be able to help. I dug through the boxes in our basement storage, found the old wallet I had used during my working years, and discovered that Catherine Morrison's business card was still tucked inside, slightly yellowed, but readable. She answered on the second ring. "Meredith?" Her voice was older, but still carried that sharp intelligence I remembered from our years working together. "I was wondering when you'd call." "I need help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, even though Graham was at work and couldn't possibly hear me. "And I don't know who else to ask." "Come to my office," she said immediately. "We'll figure this out together." An hour later, I was sitting in Catherine's corner office on the 12th floor of the Morrison & Associates building, explaining everything I had found. The office had changed since I had last seen it, with new furniture and updated technology, but Catherine herself was exactly as I remembered, sharp eyes that missed nothing, a direct manner that cut through nonsense, the kind of competence that came from decades of solving problems that seemed unsolvable. She listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a legal pad, her expression growing harder with each revelation. When I finished, she leaned back in her leather chair and studied me with something that might have been respect. "You've gathered quite a bit on your own," she said. "Most women in your situation would have just accepted the lies and kept their heads down. But you're right. You need professional help to make sense of all this. Lucky for you, I know someone." That's how I met Margaret Holloway. Margaret was retired from the Ashford Police Department, where she had spent 25 years investigating financial crimes and fraud cases that made headlines and sent executives to prison. Now, she worked as a private investigator, specializing in cases that required both legal expertise and the kind of tenacity that couldn't be taught. Catherine assured me there was no one better at uncovering hidden money and secret lives. She was a small woman in her early 60s with silver hair cropped short and practical, and eyes that seemed to see right through whatever facade you tried to present. Her office was nothing like Catherine's polished corporate space, just a small room above a dry cleaning business, with file cabinets lining every wall and a desk buried under stacks of paper that somehow still seemed organized. When I walked in for our first meeting, she looked me up and down with an assessment that felt like an X-ray. "You look like a woman who's finally stopped pretending," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Good. That makes my job easier." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. "Tell me everything," she continued, pulling a fresh notebook from her drawer. "And I mean everything. The things you're sure about, the things you suspect, and the things you're afraid to admit even to yourself. Don't waste my time with what you think I want to hear. I want the truth." So I told her about the hotel receipts and the mysterious bank transfers, about Graham's constant criticism and the way he had systematically isolated me from everyone I once cared about the career I had given up and the woman I had lost somewhere along the way, about the fear that had kept me silent for so long, and the anger that was finally starting to break through. Margaret took notes, asked questions, and never once suggested that I was being paranoid or overreacting, never once implied that I should try harder to make my marriage work or consider what I might have done to drive my husband away. By the end of our 3-hour meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Believed. "Here's what I think is happening," Margaret said, reviewing her notes with the focused attention of someone who had spent a career putting puzzle pieces together. "Your husband is having an affair. That much is obvious from the hotel charges and the jewelry purchases. But there's something else going on here, something bigger." "What do you mean?" "Those transfers to the unknown account, they're too regular, too systematic to be simple personal spending. And the amounts are too large for gifts to a mistress, unless she's the most expensive woman in history. This looks like embezzlement." The word hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. Embezzlement? It was one thing to discover your husband was cheating. It was another thing entirely to realize he might be stealing from the company that employed him, the company that had built his reputation and paid for our house and funded the life he was now secretly destroying. "I need to investigate further," Margaret continued. "But if I'm right, Graham isn't just betraying you. He's betraying everyone who trusted him at Hartwell Financial, and that changes everything about how we handle this." Over the next 6 months, Margaret dug into every aspect of Graham's financial life with the thoroughness of an archaeologist excavating a tomb. She traced the mysterious account to a shell company registered in Delaware, one of thousands of anonymous entities created specifically to hide money from prying eyes. She documented the pattern of transfers that coincided with large corporate transactions at Hartwell Financial, transactions that Graham had been responsible for overseeing. She identified the woman Graham was seeing, a junior analyst named Stephanie Prescott, who had joined the company 3 years earlier, and had since received promotions and raises that far exceeded her qualifications. Each piece of evidence was another blow, another confirmation that my entire marriage had been built on lies that went deeper than infidelity. But somewhere in the process of uncovering the truth, somewhere between the late-night phone calls with Margaret and the secret meetings at her cramped office, something unexpected happened. I started finding myself again. Maybe it was the act of taking control after so many years of helplessness, of doing something instead of merely enduring. Maybe it was the validation of having someone believe me after decades of being told my perceptions were wrong. Maybe it was simply the clarity that came from finally seeing reality instead of the distorted version Graham had trained me to accept. Whatever the reason, the woman who had been quietly disappearing for 23 years started to re-emerge from the shadows. I began exercising again, something Graham had always mocked as a waste of time for someone with my figure. I got up early every morning and walked through our neighborhood, feeling my body grow stronger with each passing week. I reconnected with old friends, including several from my accounting days, who welcomed me back without judgment or I told you so's. I started reading books about narcissistic abuse and emotional manipulation, recognizing pattern after pattern in the pages, seeing my own story reflected in the experiences of other women who had been systematically diminished by partners who claimed to love them. And I began to plan. Margaret had uncovered enough evidence to destroy Graham several times over, but I didn't want destruction. Or rather, I didn't want just destruction. I wanted justice. I wanted vindication. I wanted the world to see the truth about the man they all admired, the man who had spent 23 years convincing everyone that I was the problem while he quietly stole millions and betrayed everyone who trusted him. The annual Hartwell Financial Gala was the perfect opportunity. The party was held every December, a lavish celebration of the company's success over the past year, a showcase of wealth and achievement that attracted attention from business publications and industry observers. All senior employees were expected to attend with their spouses, presenting the unified front of professional success and personal stability that corporations valued above almost everything else. Graham had been reminding me about the event for weeks, reminding me to lose weight so I wouldn't embarrass him, reminding me to buy a new dress that didn't make me look like a grandmother, reminding me not to say anything stupid in front of Douglas Harrison, who was apparently considering Graham for a position on the executive team. As if I was the one who should be worried about embarrassment, as if I was the one with secrets to hide. 2 weeks before the party, Margaret delivered her final report. 300 pages of documented evidence, including bank records that traced every stolen dollar, photographs of Graham and Stephanie at various hotels and restaurants, recorded phone conversations that captured both the affair and discussions of the embezzlement scheme in explicit detail. The total amount Graham had stolen was staggering. Nearly $2 million over 5 years, funneled through shell companies into accounts controlled by Graham and his mistress. Money that should have belonged to Hartwell Financial's shareholders, to the retirement funds of ordinary employees, to the clients who trusted the company with their investments. But that wasn't all. The investigation had also uncovered something I hadn't expected, something that explained so much about why I had felt so isolated, so dismissed, so consistently undermined in every social situation involving Graham's colleagues. Graham had been spreading stories about me for years, telling colleagues that I was mentally unstable, that I had paranoid delusions, that I imagined problems where none existed. He told them I had been hospitalized during a nervous breakdown after our second child was born, a complete fabrication. He confided that he stayed married to me out of pity and obligation, that he couldn't bring himself to leave such a fragile woman. He painted himself as a long-suffering husband trapped with a crazy wife, and his coworkers had believed every word, because why wouldn't they? Graham was so charming, so reasonable, so successful. Why would a man like that lie? No wonder they laughed so easily at the party. No wonder they wiped tears from their eyes when he humiliated me in front of everyone. They had been primed for years to see me as a joke, the crazy wife, the unstable burden, the punchline to a story Graham had been telling long before that night. The final piece of Margaret's report was a list of email addresses for every senior employee at Hartwell Financial, along with their personal cell phone numbers. Margaret had obtained them through methods she didn't explain and I didn't ask about. The company's IT security was, ironically, not nearly as robust as its investment portfolio. I spent 3 days composing the email that would end my marriage and Graham's career. It was addressed to the entire senior leadership team, the board of directors, and selected members of the financial press who covered corporate scandals. It contained attachments of the most damning evidence, a summary of Graham's embezzlement scheme, documentation of his affair with a subordinate, and a brief, personal statement about the man behind the carefully constructed facade. The email was scheduled to send at exactly 9:37 p.m. on the night of the gala. I had calculated the timing carefully after consulting with Margaret about the typical schedule of such events. The party officially started at 7, with cocktail hour running until 8. Dinner and speeches would occupy the next hour, followed by dancing and socializing. By 9:37, the formal portion of the evening would be over. Everyone would have their phones nearby checking messages and social media, and the champagne would have flowed freely enough that reactions would be uninhibited. They would all receive the same message at exactly the same moment. And then they would look at the man they had admired, the colleague they had trusted, the friend they had believed, and they would see the truth. All I had to do was survive until then. The morning of the party, I woke with a strange sense of calm, like the stillness before a storm that you know is coming but can't prevent. Graham was already in the shower, singing off-key, as he always did when he was in a good mood, probably anticipating another evening of being admired and envied by colleagues who didn't know what he really was. I lay in bed and listened to him, wondering if this was the last morning I would spend in this house, in this marriage, in this life I had built on someone else's lies. The sheets were expensive, 800 thread count Egyptian cotton that Graham had insisted on because appearances mattered. The room was decorated in the neutral tones he preferred, beige and cream and gray, colors without passion or personality. I had lived in this space for 12 years, and it still didn't feel like mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Everything is ready. All systems go." "Are you absolutely sure about this?" I typed back a single word, "Yes." Then I got up and began preparing for the last act of a play that had been running for 23 years too long. I spent the afternoon getting ready, but not in the way Graham assumed. He thought I was primping for his benefit, beautifying myself to be a suitable accessory on his arm, a trophy wife polished for display. But I was getting ready for myself, for the woman I had been before I met him, for the woman I was finally becoming again. The emerald dress had hung in my closet for 3 years, a gift for our 20th anniversary that Graham had presented with one hand while criticizing my appearance with the other. I had tried it on exactly once, in the privacy of our bedroom, and thought I looked beautiful. Then I had seen Graham's expression, the curled lip and the dismissive glance, and I had put it away, convinced that I was wrong about that too. Tonight, I tried it on again, and this time, I believed what I saw in the mirror. A woman who had survived 2 decades of being told she was worthless. A woman who had found the strength to fight back. A woman who deserved better than the man who had tried to convince her she deserved nothing at all. By the time Graham called for me to come downstairs, his voice carrying that impatient edge that meant I was testing his patience by existing, I was ready. "You look acceptable," he said, barely glancing at me as he adjusted his cufflinks in the hallway mirror. Try not to embarrass me tonight. Douglas Harrison is considering me for the executive team, and I need to make a good impression. I smiled and said nothing. The email was scheduled. The evidence was compiled. The truth was waiting to be revealed. Nothing Graham said could touch me anymore. The drive to the Grandview Hotel took 20 minutes through evening traffic. Graham spent most of it on his phone, texting someone with quick fingers and a secretive smile that I now recognized as communication with Stephanie. I watched the city lights blur past my window and thought about all the women throughout history who had sat in similar silence, enduring similar betrayals, swallowing similar rage until it poisoned them from the inside. I would not be poisoned anymore. The ballroom was already crowded when we arrived, the holiday decorations glittering beneath lights that cost more to rent for one evening than some families spent on Christmas for a year. Graham immediately abandoned me near the coat check to work the room, leaving me standing alone with nothing but a glass of champagne and 23 years of regret for company. I spotted Stephanie Prescott almost immediately. She was tall and blonde, exactly the type Graham had always claimed to prefer, though I suspected his preference had more to do with youth and availability than hair color. She stood near the bar in a red dress that was slightly too short for a company function, laughing at something Douglas Harrison was saying, her hand resting casually on the CEO's arm in a way that suggested familiarity beyond the professional. Interesting. I filed that observation away and wondered how many men Stephanie was playing, how many relationships she was cultivating for advancement. Graham thought he was special to her. I was sure of that. Men like Graham always thought they were special, but Stephanie had the calculating eyes of a survivor, and I suspected Graham was just one rung on a ladder she intended to climb until she reached the top. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of forced conversations and barely concealed condescension. Graham's colleagues treated me exactly as I expected, with polite dismissal that barely masked their contempt for the crazy wife their favorite vice president had so nobly stayed married to. The women looked through me as if I was invisible. The men offered perfunctory greetings before turning to more interesting conversations with each other. I smiled and nodded and counted down the minutes. At 9:15, I excused myself from a particularly tedious conversation about golf and made my way toward the powder room. I needed a moment alone to steady myself for what was coming. My hands were trembling slightly, the first sign that my calm was cracking under the pressure of anticipation. The bathroom was mercifully empty. I stood at the sink and stared at my reflection, searching for some sign of the woman I had been. Before Graham, some trace of the confident accountant who had been on track for partnership before she gave it all away. She was still there, I realized, buried under years of criticism and doubt, but still there, still waiting. 9:23. I checked my phone. The email was still scheduled, the countdown timer showing 14 minutes until delivery. 14 minutes until 200 phones buzzed simultaneously. 14 minutes until the truth. I took a deep breath, reapplied my lipstick, and walked back into the ballroom. Graham found me almost immediately, his hand closing around my arm with more force than was necessary. "There you are," he said, loud enough for the people around us to hear. "I've been looking everywhere for my beautiful wife." The lie was so smooth, so practiced. He had never once called me beautiful in private, not in years. But appearances mattered to Graham, and appearances demanded that he occasionally acknowledge my existence as something other than a burden. "Come on," he continued, steering me toward the bar with proprietary authority. "Let's get a drink and mingle. Douglas wants to meet you properly." I let him guide me through the crowd, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. 9:27, 9:28, 9:29. Douglas Harrison stood near the bar surrounded by senior executives, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair, and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered. Stephanie was beside him, her smile faltering slightly when she saw us approach, her eyes darting between Graham and me with something that might have been nervousness. "Ah, Graham," Douglas said warmly. "And this must be the famous Meredith. I've heard so much about you." "I'm sure you have," I replied, holding out my hand and meeting his eyes with a directness that clearly surprised him. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you properly, Douglas. Graham speaks very highly of you." The small talk continued for several minutes, the usual dance of corporate pleasantries that I had participated in hundreds of times over the years. Douglas was charming and attentive, asking about my background and my children with what seemed like genuine curiosity. I answered his questions while watching Stephanie's growing discomfort out of the corner of my eye, noticing the way she inched closer to the door with each passing minute. 9:34. Graham touched my arm. "Darling, let's get a photo together," he said, his voice carrying that false warmth that made my skin crawl, for the company newsletter. I allowed him to guide me toward a photographer stationed near the entrance, a young woman with a professional camera and a bored expression. We posed in front of a backdrop, decorated with the Hartwell Financial logo. Graham's arm draped possessively around my waist, both of us smiling for the camera like the happy couple we had never really been. That's when I decided to lean in for a kiss, a small gesture of affection, the kind of thing wives did at company parties. One last test of the man I had married, one final chance for him to be something other than what I knew he was. And Graham pulled back. The words came out of his mouth like they had been waiting there all along, like he had been rehearsing them for years, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the killing blow. "You're uglier than a barn cow." "Why would I kiss you? I'd rather kiss the cow." The laughter erupted around us, and I understood with perfect clarity what was happening. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of cruelty born of too much champagne or a bad day at the office. This was calculated, planned. Graham had brought me to this party specifically to humiliate me in front of his colleagues, to reinforce the narrative he had been building for years, to prove once and for all that he was the victim of his marriage and I was the burden he had nobly carried. He wanted everyone to see how much he despised me. He wanted them to pity him for being married to such a pathetic woman. He wanted to inoculate himself against anything I might say about him in the future, establishing so thoroughly that I was crazy and worthless that no one would believe me if I tried to tell the truth. What he didn't know was that I had already told the truth, 300 pages of it, currently sitting in 200 email inboxes, waiting for the send command. I checked my watch, 9:35, 2 minutes. I set down my champagne glass and smiled. Not a forced smile, not a broken smile, not the smile of a woman who had just been destroyed in front of hundreds of witnesses. This was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And now we've arrived back where we started. Me, standing at the DJ booth with a microphone in my hand. Graham, frozen near the appetizer table with his confident smile finally cracking as he realized his entertainment had gone off script. 200 people staring in stunned silence, waiting to see what the crazy wife would do next. I raised the microphone to my lips. "Check your phones." 3 words, 3 syllables, 3 beats of silence before the collective sound of 200 phones buzzing at once filled the ballroom like a swarm of angry bees disturbed from their hive. I watched Graham's face as he pulled out his phone, watched the confusion transform into disbelief as he read the subject line, watched disbelief become horror as he opened the attachments, watched horror become something approaching panic as he realized what I had done, what evidence I had gathered, what truth I had finally unleashed. Around him, his colleagues were going through the same transformation. The laughter that had filled the room moments before was replaced by gasps and whispered conferences, and the sound of fingers scrolling through documents that proved Graham Mitchell was not the man they thought they knew. Hartwell Financial, $2 million embezzlement scheme uncovered. The subject line alone was enough to change everything, but the attachments, the bank records showing money flowing into shell companies, the photographs of Graham and Stephanie at hotels where neither of them had any business being, the recorded phone calls discussing transfers and cover-ups, and the various ways they planned to disappear when they had stolen enough, those were what turned Graham's world to ashes. I stepped down from the DJ platform and walked calmly toward the exit. The crowd parted for me again, but this time their eyes held something different. Not contempt, not pity, not the dismissive amusement they had shown me for years. Something that might have been respect, something that might have been shock, something that might have been the dawning realization that they had all been fooled by a man they trusted. Douglas Harrison intercepted me near the door, his face pale beneath his executive tan. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." I smiled at him, feeling the weight of 23 years lifting from my shoulders. "I'm not Mrs. Mitchell anymore, and I think you should be talking to your lawyers, not to me." Behind us, I could hear Graham shouting, denying everything, demanding that someone explain what was happening, insisting that I was crazy, that I had fabricated everything, that none of it was true. His voice grew more desperate with each passing second, the polished facade crumbling in real time as people who had admired him for years began backing away from the man they now realized they had never really known. Stephanie Prescott was trying to slip out a side door when security stopped her. I had included her role in the scheme in my email, of course. Partners in crime should face justice together. I walked out of the Grandview Hotel and into the cold December night. The stars were bright above the city lights, clearer than they had seemed in years. And for the first time since I was 27 years old, I felt like I could breathe. My phone rang. Lauren's name flashed on the screen. "Mom?" Her voice was thick with emotion, somewhere between tears and laughter. "I just got the strangest email forward from someone at Dad's company. What's happening?" "I'm coming home, sweetheart," I said, my own voice steady and strong, in a way it hadn't been for longer than I could remember. "And when I get there, I'll tell you everything." The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Graham didn't contest it, probably because he was too busy dealing with the criminal charges that had been filed against him by multiple jurisdictions. Embezzlement, securities fraud, tax evasion, wire fraud. The list grew longer with each passing week as investigators followed the trail of money and lies he had spent years creating. Stephanie Prescott turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. She testified about everything: the shell companies, the fake invoices, the years of carefully coordinated theft, the plans they had made to disappear together when they had stolen enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Her testimony sealed Graham's fate and earned her 3 years in federal prison instead of the 15 she might have faced. Graham was sentenced to 12 years with no possibility of parole. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I had already wasted enough of my life on Graham Mitchell and his lies. The money he had stolen was traced and recovered over the following years, a process that involved forensic accountants and federal investigators and more lawyers than I had ever known existed. Hartwell Financial sued him for damages and won. The shell companies were dissolved. The secret accounts were emptied and returned to their rightful owners. I received a settlement in the divorce that was more than fair given the circumstances, along with the house, which I sold immediately, and half of Graham's legitimate retirement accounts, which had been frozen pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. It wasn't enough to replace the career I had given up, the years I had lost, the woman I had forgotten how to be. But it was enough to start over. More than enough. Catherine Morrison offered me a job the week after the party. before the divorce was even filed. A real job, using the forensic accounting skills I had apparently been developing for the past 18 months without realizing that's what I was doing. I started part-time, learning the changes in regulations and software that had occurred during my years away from the profession. Then full-time, taking on my own cases, then finding myself being promoted to positions I had never imagined holding. Senior investigator, department head, partner. Margaret Holloway became not just an investigator, but a friend. We met for coffee every few weeks, trading stories about our cases, her current ones, and my past. She told me I was one of the strongest women she had ever worked with. I told her I was just someone who had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. Lauren flew in from Seattle for my 53rd birthday, bringing her boyfriend, a kind young man named David, who looked at her the way Graham had never looked at me, with genuine admiration and respect and love that didn't come with conditions attached. Brandon came too, taking a week off from his Boston job to celebrate with his mother. We sat around the table in my new apartment, smaller than the house but somehow more spacious because it was mine alone. And they asked me to tell them the story again. The story of the party. The story of the 3 words. "Check your phones," I said, and we all laughed, but Lauren wasn't satisfied. "I always wondered, Mom," she said, leaning forward with the curiosity that had defined her since childhood. "Why didn't you just leave? Why go through all that? Gathering evidence, planning the reveal. Why not just walk away and move on with your life?" I thought about her question for a long time before answering, because it deserved more than a glib response. Because walking away wouldn't have changed anything, I finally said. Your father would have kept his job, his reputation, his mistress. He would have told everyone I was crazy, the way he'd been telling them for years, and they would have believed him. He would have gone on hurting people, stealing from people, destroying anyone who got in his way. I paused, remembering the weight of the microphone in my hand, the silence before the phone started buzzing, the moment when everything changed. I didn't just want to leave, I continued. I wanted the truth to matter. I wanted everyone who had ever laughed at me, dismissed me, pitied me, to see who the real victim was, and who the real monster was. I wanted justice, not just for myself, but for all the people Graham had deceived and stolen from over the years. Brandon reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with something that might have been tears. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. "I know I don't say it enough, but I am. You taught us that standing up for what's right is worth the cost." "Me too," Lauren added. "You taught us that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and fighting for the truth." I looked at my children, these 2 remarkable adults who had somehow survived growing up in a home filled with so much dysfunction, and felt something warm bloom in my chest. "I taught you that?" I asked. Lauren smiled. "Every day, Mom, even when you didn't realize it." 2 years after the party, I received an unexpected letter. The return address was a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, and I knew before I opened it what it would contain. Graham wanted to apologize. I sat with that letter for 3 days before opening it. When I finally read it, I found exactly what I expected. Explanations that sounded like excuses, remorse that felt calculated, designed to manipulate rather than express genuine regret, a request for forgiveness that seemed more about his own redemption than my healing, complaints about his treatment in prison, suggestions that I had overreacted, that I could have handled things differently, that the public humiliation was unnecessary. Even from behind bars, he was still trying to make himself the victim. I didn't write back. Some people might call that bitter. Some might say, I should have offered forgiveness, that holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it. Turn the other cheek, they might say. Be the bigger person. But here's what I've learned in the years since that party. Forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of their betrayal. And you can do that without ever speaking to them again. You can do that without granting them absolution for sins they haven't truly repented. I forgave Graham, not for his sake, but for mine. I forgave him for the years of criticism and the stolen career and the isolation and the lies. I forgave him because carrying all that anger was exhausting, and I had better things to do with my energy. I forgave him because my happiness couldn't depend on his remorse. But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean reconciling with someone who would hurt you again if given the chance. Some bridges deserve to stay burned. Last month, I stood at the podium of the Ashford Chamber of Commerce accepting an award for excellence in financial investigation. The woman presenting it was Catherine Morrison, who had somehow convinced the selection committee that her former employee turned partner deserved recognition for helping to uncover one of the largest corporate fraud cases in the city's history and going on to expose several more in the years since. When she handed me the Crystal Award, she leaned in and whispered, "I told you 15 years ago that you'd regret leaving." I smiled and whispered back, "You were right, but I'm glad I finally came back." The applause was warm and genuine, so different from the cruel laughter at the Hartwell Financial Gala. I looked out at the audience and saw faces that respected me, valued me, saw me for who I really was, and appreciated what I had accomplished. Among them was a man named Robert Chen, an attorney I had met at a professional conference 2 years earlier. We had been dating for 8 months, and he was nothing like Graham. Patient where Graham had been demanding, kind where Graham had been cruel. He saw me, really saw me. And what he saw made him smile every single day. After the ceremony, Robert took my hand and led me onto the dance floor. The band was playing something slow and sweet, a song I didn't recognize but found myself swaying to nonetheless. "You know," he said softly, his arms warm around me, "I never asked you about that night. The party, the 3 words. I read about it in the papers, of course, but I wanted to hear it from you. What do you want to know?" He pulled back slightly to look at me, his eyes full of curiosity and something deeper. "Were you scared?" I thought about the question, about standing on that platform with a microphone in my hand and 200 people waiting to see what the crazy wife would do. Terrified, I admitted, but not of Graham. Not of what would happen next. I was scared of what would happen if I stayed silent, if I let him win, if I walked out of that ballroom without anyone knowing the truth. Robert nodded slowly. "What made you finally decide to speak?" I remembered the moment clearly, the laughter echoing off the marble floors, Graham's cruel smile, the champagne glass trembling in my hand, and then the certainty that washed over me like a wave, sweeping away everything I had been afraid of. I realized that I had 2 choices, I said. I could stay invisible and let him destroy me completely, let the narrative he had created become the only truth anyone knew, or I could speak 3 words and take back my power, take back my story, take back my life. Robert smiled. "Check your phones." I shook my head. Those were the words I said, but that wasn't the choice. Then what was? I looked up at him, at this kind man who wanted to understand, who listened without judging, who treated me like an equal partner rather than a burden to be managed. The choice was between silence and truth, I said, between disappearing and standing up, between being the woman Graham wanted me to be and becoming the woman I was always meant to be. I leaned into his embrace as the music swelled around us, feeling safe for the first time in longer than I could remember. "I chose truth," I whispered, "and it set me free." Sometimes I still think about that night, about the emerald dress and the crystal chandeliers and the 200 people who watched my husband try to humiliate me into oblivion. I think about Stephanie Prescott, who served her 3 years and is now working at a small coffee shop in another state, her financial career permanently destroyed, her dreams of wealth and luxury reduced to minimum wage and rented rooms. I think about Douglas Harrison, who was forced to resign when it came out that he had ignored warning signs about Graham's behavior for years, who lost his pension and his reputation and the legacy he had spent decades building. I think about all the people who laughed at me that night, who wiped tears of amusement from their eyes while I stood frozen in humiliation. Some of them have apologized since then, awkward letters and uncomfortable phone calls expressing regret for their cruelty. Some of them pretend the whole thing never happened when they see me around town, looking away quickly and crossing to the other side of the street. But mostly, I think about the woman I used to be, the one who believed she was ugly and worthless and lucky that anyone would want her at all, the one who gave up everything for a man who gave nothing in return, the one who let criticism become truth and isolation become normal and abuse become just the way things were. She deserved better than Graham Mitchell. She deserved better than the mother who told her she had a face for radio. She deserved better than the colleagues who treated her like a joke and the friends who abandoned her when she needed them most. She deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be loved for exactly who she was. And finally, after 55 years on this earth, she is. My name is Meredith Chen now. I took Robert's name when we married last spring, in a small ceremony, attended only by people who genuinely cared about us. Lauren stood beside me as my matron of honor. Brandon walked me down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. Margaret Holloway and Catherine Morrison sat in the front row, dabbing their eyes with tissues, 2 women who had helped me become the person standing at that altar. I wore a simple cream dress, not emerald, and when Robert leaned in to kiss me after we exchanged vows, he didn't pull back. He held me close and whispered, "I love you exactly as you are." 3 words, different words, but this time they didn't bring silence. They brought the beginning of everything. If you had told me 4 years ago that my life would look like this, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have said that women like me don't get happy endings, that the damage was too deep, the years too many, the wounds too old to ever really heal. But I would have been wrong, because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that could have happened. Sometimes hitting rock bottom is exactly what you need to find the strength to climb back up. Sometimes the cruelest words spoken by someone who was supposed to love you become the catalyst for discovering that you never needed their love in the first place. And sometimes 3 little words can change everything. Check your phones. I said them in anger and desperation as a weapon against a man who had spent 23 years trying to destroy me. But now, looking back with the clarity that only time and healing can provide, I realize they were something else entirely. They were the sound of a woman finally finding her voice. And that voice, once found, could never be silenced again.